Welcome to this module on writing a literature review. Prior to viewing this presentation, you should have read McKay Chapter 4 with special attention to the section titled Literature Review, found on pages 152 to 155. Another good resource to read over is the Feek and Swales chapter titled Getting Started on the Literature Review, available within the module. This text presents many examples of effective writing techniques for analysis and evaluation of resources. In every research article, the literature review, or more casually known as lit review, identifies what is already known and unknown about a particular research topic. It is also how you make a case for why further study of research questions is important to the field of TESOL. So before we get started, here are a few key terms to be aware of and to insert into your researcher lexicons. Pay attention to them as we go along throughout the presentation. So what makes a good lit review? A good literature review lays out the following objectives. It provides a theoretical background to frame your research study, and this is accomplished by summarizing and evaluating other research studies related to your present research question. A lit review also provides the rationale for why there is a gap in the literature, or why we need to know the answers to your research question. It is also the place where you operationalize or define key words in your study, such as explicit instruction, or effective strategies, or even the term vocabulary itself, which may seem cut and dry or obvious, but in your study, when you're looking at vocabulary, do you mean single terms, set phrases? You need to define those. So the following slides will help you to begin your own literature reviews. So I'd like to begin our discussion of the ins and outs of a lit review by first looking at an example research article that contains an effective and well-written review of the literature. The article is called Comparing Focus on Form and Focus on Forms in Second Language Vocabulary Learning by Batya Laffer. So when you read through her article, examine how she operationalizes or makes a case for her key research terms focus on form and focus on forms, which are terms that are usually associated with grammar, but they are applied here to vocabulary learning and teaching. Additionally, pay attention to how her language sets up the rationale for her study, and how she summarized and cited other studies, as well as defined her constructs, focus on form and focus on forms. Lastly, notice how her literature review concludes with a statement of her research purpose. The study in the present paper was designed to compare focus on form and focus on forms in incidental and intentional learning of new words. This phrase is found on page 153 in her article. Ending a lit review with a purpose statement is an effective way to create reader buy-in, to have your reader say, yes, this construct is of utmost importance to the field of TESOL. At this time, you may pause the presentation and read the article accessible below in the module. So writing a lit review is what's called an iterative process. That is, as you gain understanding, you'll return to earlier steps to rethink, refine, and rework your literature review. A lit review generally has 5 steps. You start with article collection, you build background, you organize your thoughts and review, you compose your narrative, and then you edit and revise for precise and succinct language. As stated before, when going through the process of putting together a quality lit review, you may go through this process more than once and jump ahead or maybe even back a few steps as needed. So now that you've read over an example lit review, the Laffer 2006 article, it's time to start thinking about your own. The first step in conducting a lit review is to brainstorm all the keywords related to your research question. You'll also want to look for primary studies, not secondary studies. Primary studies are reports of original studies conducted by the researcher or researchers. Secondary resources are articles that summarize other people's work. In essence, literature reviews are secondary sources. It is good practice to avoid other secondary sources when you're writing your lit review. What I do to help find these primary sources is start with broader search terms such as second language vocabulary, and then I scroll through the articles, titles, and abstracts till I find those that relate to my construct. Also, you see that databases and articles often contain keyword tags that relate to that topic. You can then also pull in more search terms from there. For example, in Laufer's article index in EBSCO, she lists here the keywords learning, which I do not recommend. This is too broad. Lexicology, vocabulary, comprehension, etc. Other popular keywords in the second language vocabulary field include L2 vocabulary, lexicon, ESL, EFL, SLA, L2, lexical complexity, lexical diversity, word frequency, and so forth. Visit our research courses library guide available in the module resources below for more help. Lastly, I recommend making a folder dedicated to your lit review and titling each save file with the author's name, year of publication, and an abbreviated title. This will help to keep you organized. So when you're scouring the databases for articles, how do we know if the article is appropriate or connected to our research questions? First, an appropriate article to include in our lit review is one that is scholarly in nature and is a primary source. Remember, a primary source is a report by the original researcher written by that researcher. Primary sources are preferable for inclusion because in a lit review, they strengthen your credibility as a researcher. In other words, using primary sources show that you have carefully considered the research that has already been done related to your research question. Secondary sources can be used, but sparingly. It's because these sources are summaries and authored by those not involved in the original study, and as such, they are better suited for your introduction section that gives background on common knowledge of the field, provides historical context, or defines the particular research problem. So as we know, when we receive a list of search results from a database, we can view the title, author, keywords, and abstracts of these various research articles returned on your search. You can use this information to make a judgment call on whether or not the study would be suitable for your lit review based on this information before you have to download and read the article in its entirety. If you are still not sure, you may wish to download the article and read through the headings in the body of the article. These headings and subheadings can give you an overview of the article's content and tell you if the article is a primary source. Remember, headings in primary research reports follow the standardized format of introduction, lit review or background, methods or methodology, results, discussions, and references. You can also tell if an article is a quality source by looking at the journal in which it is published. Here is a brief sampling of prominent journals in our field. To view a more comprehensive list, visit the website listing major journals linked in the module resources below. So the second step is then to write a broad thesis statement that will help to guide you as you read through all your articles that you collected and focus your attentions to how the precedent studies relate to your topic. So let's further break down Laufer's thesis statement to see how it sets the tone for the lit review and grabs the reader's attention. Her example here says, the realization of applied linguists that second language learners cannot achieve high levels of grammatical competence from entirely meaning-centered instruction has led them to propose that learners can benefit from form-focused instruction on page 150. Notice how Laufer's thesis statement relates to a pedagogical problem that researchers and teachers face and can relate to. It also directly connects to her research questions. As such, she touches on three important items in her opening statement that makes a particularly effective and clear thesis for our field of TESOL. She first identifies the target population of her study, second language learners. Laufer then references the pedagogical problem faced by people in our field of language teaching and learning, that ELs have trouble achieving high levels of grammatical competence from meaning-centered instruction. She then concludes her thesis with the construct of the study, form-focused instruction. Including these three types of items in the opening line of your literature review is a particularly effective way for focusing the narrative that is to come. So once you have your articles and thesis statement, you will need to carefully read through your articles and resources, and maybe even gather more as you go through the studies. You will then want to weed through the abundance of articles to include those resources that pertain to the major theories, constructs, variables, and complexities of your research problem. It's also a good idea to take a page out of Laufer's book and present multiple viewpoints in your literature review to present others' ideas and then build an argument towards your research question. If you look back at Laufer's article, you'll notice how she presents sources for both for and against form-focused instruction. But she does make it clear that her hypothesis is that some type of form-focused instruction is needed in the classroom, and she will test this hypothesis in a quantitative study. After picking out your key articles to include in your lit review, the next step is to organize your thoughts to make a coherent and cohesive narrative. Every good lit review begins with an introduction that states the research problem, moves to the body which reviews and evaluates precedent studies, and concludes with your research question and/or statement. The key to building an effective narrative lies in the body. Lit reviews traditionally are organized in one of three ways, and it's up to you which pattern suits your topic and research problem. You can choose to organize your review chronologically, thematically, or methodologically. A chronological orientation illustrates how your particular variable or construct has evolved over time. Subheadings deal with time periods and usually end with why your research question still warrants current investigation. A thematic orientation, though, discusses the various theories as they inform your research problem. Subheadings here deal with theories or constructs and ends with why your research question adds another layer to its precedence. This organizational flow tends to be the most popular in our field. I also like to create a bubble web graphic organizer to help me to write this kind of lit review. Lastly, you could organize your lit review methodologically, which evaluates how your research problem has been investigated in the past. Your subheadings here center on research methods and ends with how your study will fix these methodological issues. A methodological pattern is likely not appropriate for our class's research questions, but it is good to be aware of this orientation in case you come across it when you're reading through the source articles for your project. As you compose your narrative, it is important to take notice when you are making a claim that a particular idea or construct is important. When you do this, be sure to back this up using one of your key articles. Also, when reading through so many articles containing so much information, it can be overwhelming to think of how to summarize these studies. So it is very important to be selective in the information you choose to present from each article. Keep thinking back to that organizational pattern. If you're using a thematic pattern, then stick to presenting key themes and findings that have emerged. If you're using a chronological orientation, summarize the article in terms of how the findings relate to the time period in which it was published. Lastly, you should sparingly use quotes. It is always better to summarize and paraphrase with citations. When choosing to use a quote, it means that you are greatly emphasizing that point. So think of direct quotes as delivering the heavy punch. You want to use them strategically and only when you really want to knock out any wandering thoughts your reader might have. If you need additional support in how to paraphrase, quote, or avoid unintentional plagiarism, please visit the Avoiding Plagiarism in Research page linked below and located in the Research Resources page. So because we want to summarize and paraphrase precedent research in a succinct but effective way, it is critical that we take notice how lit reviews are actually quite formulaic in how they're written. Let's look at an example from Laufer, who often took the traditional thematic approach to organizing her lit review. You'll notice she opens her summary with a claim that focus on form's proponents have criticized the focus on form approach. She then proceeds to summarize the conclusions from precedent studies to support this claim, citing noted researchers Doherty and Varela, Elas, and Sheen to show that focus on forms has merit, and concludes her summary of the construct with a statement justifying her present investigation into the focus on forms approach. When you are composing your narrative, think about including these 3 items in your summaries: state a claim, provide evidence, and justify your research questions. Make sure to use in-text citations. A tip for you is to write your annotated bibliography annotations in a manner in which you can later pull sentences from these summaries into your lit review. Our field of second language acquisition in TESOL uses APA style for citing resources. This means that there are particular conventions and rules to follow when writing a literature review. You may want to take a moment to pause this presentation and download the Feek and Swales chapter found in the module, then resume this presentation. The first thing to consider is how you will reference or cite the studies you gleaned from your article searches. You can choose to reference these authors and studies through an integral or non-integral citation pattern. Take a moment to look at page 46 in the Feek and Swales text. Do you notice the difference between these citation patterns? You'll see that integral patterns use the author's names within the narrative. This is a great approach when you want to emphasize the researcher, like when you're citing big names in the field such as Batia Laufer, Paul Nation, or Keith Fulce. You may choose non-integral patterns, though, when you want the emphasis to be on the study's findings and not the author, like when you make a claim that focus on forms instruction is more effective than focus on form. Your verb tense and aspect is another important part of your language to pay attention to. Take a moment to read through Feek and Swales' recommendations on page 52 for when to use which verb tense. Lastly, because our field of TESOL and second language acquisition favors reviews that are objective in their presentation, we want to avoid using hard verbs and use more objective or softer reporting verbs. On page 55 in Feek and Swales, there is a table with the most commonly used verbs in our field. So take a moment to look these over. To avoid repetition of particular verbs, be strategic also in varying the verbs that you use. So now you should have a better idea about how to craft your own literature review. At this point in time, you should have a general idea of your research topic and maybe even your research question. As you begin collecting and reading through the precedent research, pay attention to the methods those studies use to research their variables to see if one of the data collection methods could work for your own research project. Also begin taking notes on how you might summarize the article's findings in your own words to present in your annotated bibliography. I'll be checking in with everyone over the next couple weeks about your research questions, so look for an email from me in your Salem State email inboxes. Happy reading!